Normandy, July 1944. A veteran German sharpshooter shifts his weight on the crumbling stone of a ruined church tower, his breathing slow and measured. For the German sniper, the setting sun traditionally signaled the beginning of his absolute dominion. Under the cover of total darkness, he was the unseen apex predator, able to strike psychological terror into the hearts of exhausted Allied infantry with a single, echoing crack from the shadows. But tonight, the darkness offers him no sanctuary. A faint, almost imperceptible scuff of canvas on stone echoes from the pitch-black stairwell below him. It is followed not by the chaotic, noisy approach of standard infantry, but by a terrifying, surgical silence. A shadow moves with unnatural discipline, armed with blackened blades and suppressed weaponry. The German hunter suddenly realizes he has become the prey. To the elite marksmen of the Wehrmacht, the night was supposed to be an impenetrable shield, yet a specific breed of British night patrol turned that darkness into a lethal trap. Why did Axis soldiers fear this silent Allied ingenuity more than anything else on the battlefield? To understand the specific, cold-blooded dread that British night patrols inspired among the German elite, one must first understand the brutal geography of the Norman battlefield and the absolute supremacy the Germans enjoyed during the daylight hours. By June and July of 1944, the Allied advance had ground to a bloody, agonizing crawl in the Bocage, a patchwork quilt of ancient sunken country lanes and massive earthen banks topped with dense, impenetrable thorn bushes. For the German defender, this terrain was an architectural masterpiece of natural fortifications. It was a landscape custom-built for the sharpshooter, the German sniper. Hidden within the tangled roots and thick foliage of the hedgerows, a single well-camouflaged German marksman could pin down an entire Allied company for hours, dictating the pace of the war with clinical, terrifying precision. During the day, the German sniper was the undisputed master of this claustrophobic geometry. Armed with the Mauser Kar98k rifle, carefully selected for its exceptional accuracy and paired with state-of-the-art optical sights, the German marksman operated with a chilling sense of invulnerability. German tactical doctrine encouraged these men to act as autonomous hunters, striking high-value targets, officers, radio operators, and medics from ranges exceeding 400 meters before melting away into the brush. For the British and American infantry trapped in the sunken lanes, daylight was a curse. Moving across an open field or peering over a hedgerow was a virtual death sentence, creating a profound, paralyzing psychological condition known as sniper phobia. The Germans knew they held the upper hand, and their morale swelled with every crack of a Mauser rifle. But war in the Bocage was governed by a strict circadian rhythm, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, a profound and terrifying tactical inversion took place. The very elements that made the German sniper invincible by day became his greatest liabilities by night. The magnification of the Zeiss optics, so lethal in the sunlight, became useless dead weight in the pitch black, rendering the sniper essentially blind beyond a few dozen meters. Furthermore, German defensive doctrine in 1944 was primarily static when it came to night operations. They relied heavily on predetermined, interlocking fields of machine gun fire and trip flares to secure their perimeters, preferring to hunker down in their dugouts and wait for the safety of the morning sun. They viewed the night as a passive barrier, a time for rest and resupply, assuming the Allies would be just as hesitant to move blindly through the hostile, mined terrain.
But the British Army, however, viewed the darkness through a completely different lens, drawing on a deep institutional memory forged in the blood-soaked trench raids of the First World War and heavily influenced by the specialized, stealth-oriented training of the newly formed commandos. The British embraced the night not as a hindrance, but as an offensive weapon. General Montgomery's forces actively trained to dominate no man's land after dark. They developed a doctrine of aggressive, relentless night patrolling. This wasn't simply about gathering reconnaissance or probing enemy lines. It was about asserting a psychological dominance. The British strategy was designed to ensure that the moment the sun disappeared, the German infantry, and specifically their elite snipers, felt immediately and relentlessly hunted.
The transformation from standard infantryman into a nocturnal predator began long before the British patrol ever crossed the departure line. It was a rigorous, almost monastic ritual of sensory discipline. British commanders, heavily drawing upon the grueling syllabus of the commando units, understood that the night was an acoustic magnifying glass. In the damp, heavy air of the Norman hedgerows, a single clinking mess tin or the metallic slap of a rifle sling could echo for hundreds of meters, instantly inviting a blind, devastating spray from a pre-sighted German MG-42. To counter this, British soldiers systematically stripped themselves of the standard noisy accoutrements of modern war. The iconic steel Brodie helmets were discarded in favor of soft woolen cap comforters. This not only eliminated the metallic ring of a brushed branch, but it also broke up the recognizable hard-edged silhouette of the human head. Webbing was minimized and taped down. Faces, hands, and even the polished brass fittings on their weapons were heavily smeared with burnt cork, soot, or camouflage cream. They were purposely de-industrializing their appearance, shedding the loud, clanking machinery of the conventional soldier to become something primal, organic, and infinitely more terrifying to the men waiting in the dark. Contrast this silent progression with the sensory isolation of the German defender. The Wehrmacht infantryman was a walking percussion instrument, burdened by a uniform and kit designed for durability rather than stealth. The German sniper, who mere hours earlier had rested his rifle on a stone wall with absolute clinical confidence, now found himself trapped in a sensory void. He was locked in a static position, his high-magnification optics useless in the pitch black, relying entirely on his hearing to detect an approaching threat. But the British patrols were explicitly trained to exploit this exact biological vulnerability. They practiced shadow walking, a method of stepping heel to toe, rolling the foot outward to feel for snapping twigs before committing their body weight to the ground. They synchronized their movements with the ambient noise of the battlefield, advancing only when the wind rustled the dense leaves of the bocage or when the distant rolling thunder of artillery masked the sound of their approach. To the German sentry, straining his eyes into the abyss, the enemy was no longer a visible target. The enemy was the darkness itself. The tactical objective of these British fighting patrols was rarely a full-scale assault. It was the psychological erosion of the German front line. German defensive doctrine relied heavily on tactical wire, trip flares, and the dreaded S-mines, bounding anti-personnel fragmentation mines. A German sentry assumed these interlocking defensive belts would provide a loud, violent warning of any Allied incursion. But the British patrols possessed a terrifying surgical patience. Rather than blowing the wire with noisy Bangalore torpedoes, lead scouts would spend agonizing hours inching forward on their stomachs, feeling for tripwires with their bare fingertips. They would painstakingly cut through concertina wire, holding the severed ends to prevent the metallic resonance that would alert a German gunner. To the German troops, the silent infiltration was a profound violation of their security. They would wake in the morning light to find their barbed wire meticulously snipped and British boot prints pressed into the mud just meters from their foxholes.
It was a cold, shuddering realization that men had stood over them in the dark and chosen to let them live, this time. This realization triggered a localized psychological collapse among the German elite. The Scharfschützen, the very men who inflicted paralyzing sniper phobia upon the Allies by day, now were experiencing a terrifying inversion of that exact fear. The night, their supposed sanctuary, had been colonized by an enemy that moved like smoke. A German sniper could no longer simply rest in his hide. He had to maintain a frantic, exhausting vigil, knowing that a British patrol might already be inside his perimeter, hunting the hunters. This constant, unrelenting tension meant that when the sun finally rose, the German marksman was not the rested, cold-blooded executioner of the day before. He was exhausted, paranoid, and hyper-reactive, his nerves shredded by a night spent listening to shadows. The British had successfully turned the psychological weapon of terror back upon its masters.
For the German sniper waiting in the suffocating darkness of the Normandy Bocage, the most terrifying weapon in the British nocturnal arsenal was not a firearm, but a 7-inch piece of cold, drop-forged carbon steel, the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. To understand the psychological horror of this weapon, one must understand the traditional expectations of a frontline soldier. A German sentry or sniper assumed that any engagement would be heralded by a loud, violent auditory warning, the crack of a rifle, the chatter of a machine gun, or the blast of a grenade. The Fairbairn Sykes systematically violated this fundamental assumption of war. Designed by two British close combat experts who had cut their teeth in the violent gangland alleys of pre-war Shanghai, the dagger was engineered for absolute silent erasure. Its needle-like point was designed to bypass heavy wool uniforms and webbing, targeting the vital organs or the carotid artery with terrifying biological efficiency. The tactical deployment of the blade bred a unique paralyzing paranoia among the German frontline units. British fighting patrols did not simply stumble into German positions, they practiced the grim art of sentry removal. Using their exhaustive sensory discipline, a British scout would identify a German listening post or a sniper hide, flank the position through the dense thorn bushes, and eliminate the threat without a single sound echoing across the valley. To the German Wehrmacht, this was not just an act of combat, it was psychological warfare of the highest order. A German sniper, relying entirely on his hearing to survive the night, would feel an icy dread, knowing that a weapon existed specifically to bypass his acoustic radar. The silence of the blade meant that the man 10 meters away in the adjacent foxhole could be killed, and the sniper would know nothing about it until the sun came up. The diaries of the German defenders in the summer of 1944 are littered with the trauma of these silent infiltrations. "We awoke this morning to find Karl and Johannes dead in their forward observation post," wrote an Unteroffizier of the 352nd Infantry Division. "Their throats were cut. No one heard a struggle. No one heard a shot. The Tommies had crept right through our tripwires, killed our eyes in the dark, and vanished. The men are terrified to take the night watch. They stare into the shadows and imagine demons with blackened faces. The dark is no longer empty. It is full of ghosts with knives." This localized collapse of morale was the exact intent of the British patrols. A sniper who is terrified of the dark cannot hunt. He abandons his forward, isolated hideouts and retreats to the perceived safety of the main trench line, effectively ceding no man's land to the British. But the British could not rely on the blade alone. When a night patrol encountered a target that required firepower, they deployed a technological marvel that fundamentally broke the rules of acoustic warfare, the suppressed Sten Mk2S.
To the modern observer, a silenced weapon is a common trope, but in 1944 it was a piece of tactical black magic. The British had engineered a variant of their cheap, mass-produced submachine gun specifically for clandestine operations. The barrel was ported to bleed off gas, and it was encased in a massive bronze and steel suppressor that slowed the 9mm bullet to subsonic speeds. The result was a weapon that produced no bright muzzle flash to blind the user or alert the enemy, and generated an acoustic profile that sounded less like a firearm and more like a heavy sewing machine. For the German sniper, the suppressed Sten was a weapon of pure disorientation. Snipers are trained to survive night engagements by spotting the muzzle flashes of enemy weapons and returning precise fire. The Sten Mk2S denied them this vital visual cue. When a British patrol opened fire, the German defenders were struck by a localized storm of 9mm lead, but they had no directional vector to shoot back at. The suppressed gun created an acoustic mirage. In the dense foliage of the bocage, the sound of the bullet striking the wood or the earth was often louder than the sound of the gun firing. German patrols would find themselves taking casualties from the shadows, panicking, and firing their loud, bright weapons in every direction, instantly illuminating themselves for the rest of the British patrol to systematically dismantle.
While the Fairbairn Sykes knife and the suppressed Sten were weapons of immediate, terrifying confrontation, the British night patrols also utilized a weapon of delayed psychological torture, the offensive stay-behind trap. The German Scharfschütze relied heavily on a network of pre-prepared, highly camouflaged hides. A sniper would rarely stay in one position for long, rotating between 3 or 4 different nests to avoid detection by Allied artillery. The British actively turned this fundamental doctrine against them. Using their silent infiltration tactics, a British patrol would locate an empty German sniper hide and systematically rig it with explosives. This was not standard defensive mining, it was surgical, psychological sabotage. A British scout would balance the lever of a live Mills bomb against a rock, or attach a nearly invisible length of piano wire across the lip of the sniper's foxhole. To the German marksman creeping back to his favored position an hour before dawn, relying on muscle memory to navigate the dark, the trap was virtually undetectable. The psychological impact of the Mills bomb trap was corrosive and deeply debilitating. It destroyed the German sniper's fundamental need for a safe haven. A marksman requires a calm, steady heart rate and absolute unwavering trust in his environment to accurately calculate windage and elevation. But in the Normandy Bocage, returning to a familiar hide became a terrifying game of Russian roulette. German diaries from the 12th SS Panzer Division record the exhausting paranoia of having to painstakingly sweep their own defensive positions for tripwires every single morning. The physical exhaustion of fighting in the hedgerows was now compounded by the agonizing mental strain of assuming the ground itself had been poisoned by the British while they slept. The sniper could no longer trust his own sanctuary. This paranoia was amplified to a breaking point by the deployment of the ultimate nocturnal terror, British counter-sniping operations utilizing suppressed Lee-Enfield rifles. The German sniper believed that distance was his ultimate armor. Even at night, a German marksman felt relatively secure if he was positioned 200 meters behind the main line of resistance, resting on the assumption that any British patrol would trigger the forward infantry defenses long before reaching him. The suppressed Lee-Enfield completely shattered this illusion of depth. British commando units and specialized divisional reconnaissance patrols began fielding customized bolt-action rifles equipped with heavy experimental sound suppressors.
Firing specialized, heavy-grain subsonic ammunition, these weapons lacked the supersonic crack that defines the trajectory of a standard rifle bullet. To the German sniper peering through the gloom, the arrival of this weapon on the battlefield was an acoustic nightmare that violated every rule of long-range combat. The experience of facing suppressed counter-snipers was described by German veterans as fighting a ghost. A German Scharfschütze might fire a single careless shot at dusk, mistakenly believing his muzzle flash went unnoticed. But hours later, in the dead of night, a British patrol would navigate to a flanking position across the valley. The German would not hear the loud, distinctive report of an enemy rifle. He would only hear the terrifying, wet impact of a .33 caliber bullet striking the sandbags inches from his face, or worse, the sudden slump of his spotter dying silently beside him. This invisible ballistics created a total collapse of situational awareness. The German sniper could not return fire because there was no flash to aim at and no acoustic signature to orient his weapon toward. He was pinned down by a shooter he could not locate, forced to press his face into the mud while heavy, silent lead chipped away at his cover. The accumulation of these specific, tailored horrors, the silent blade of the Fairbairn Sykes, the whispering storm of the suppressed Sten, the booby-trapped foxhole, and the invisible sniper bullet, culminated in the ultimate psychological breakdown of the German elite. The Scharfschütze, explicitly trained to be the most cold-blooded, calculating killer on the battlefield, had been reduced to a shivering, paranoid victim. By stripping away the acoustic warnings of combat and turning the darkness from a cloak into a shroud, the British night patrols had successfully dismantled the German superiority complex. The night, which had once belonged to the predators of the Third Reich, had been violently annexed by the phantoms of the British Army.
When the strategic ledgers of the Normandy campaign were finally written, the physical casualty count inflicted by the British night patrols was often relatively low compared to the apocalyptic destruction of a daylight artillery barrage or a carpet bombing run. However, the psychological attrition they exacted was catastrophic, fundamentally altering the tactical geometry of the entire Western Front. By systematically breaking the morale of the Scharfschützen, the elite snipers who served as the linchpin of the German static defense, the British effectively unraveled the German front line from the inside out. The outcome of these nocturnal infiltrations was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. When a sniper abandons his forward hideout in terror, he leaves the infantry flanks blind and the early warning network shattered. This silent erasure created massive, unseen corridors of vulnerability that Allied armored and infantry columns would later exploit with devastating speed during the daylight breakouts. From the Axis perspective, the inability to counter the British night patrols represented a lethal systemic flaw in their late-war tactical doctrine. The Wehrmacht had built its defensive strategy in the Bocage around the concept of the impenetrable line, a rigid interlocking network of machine gun nests, trip flares, and minefields. They operated under the arrogant assumption that this industrial-scale defense would completely compensate for their lack of manpower, assuming the Allies would blindly throw themselves against the wire. But the British proved that a heavily fortified line is utterly useless if the enemy refuses to attack it conventionally. By utilizing the Fairbairn Sykes knife, the suppressed Sten, and the silenced Lee-Enfield, the British bypassed the heavy, noisy machinery of the German defense entirely. The Germans had prepared for a 20th century war of massed firepower, but they were bled dry by an enemy utilizing the primal predatory tactics of the ancient world. The long-term impact on German morale was a localized, highly infectious epidemic of nocturnal paralysis. For the ordinary German infantryman, the sniper was supposed to be their ultimate protector, a cold-blooded guardian who kept the enemy paralyzed at a distance.
When the standard infantry realized that even their most elite, invisible marksmen were being effortlessly hunted and slaughtered in the dark, a profound sense of utter helplessness infected the trenches. The night, which had historically served as the soldiers' only sanctuary for precious rest, medical evacuation, and resupply, was suddenly transformed into a theater of maximum vulnerability. Sleep deprivation became endemic across the German lines. A German battalion that spent the entire night staring wide-eyed into the pitch-black bocage, terrified of every snapping twig and shifting shadow, was a battalion that could be easily shattered by a conventional Allied assault the following morning. The German reliance on the daytime superiority of their optics and their high-speed machine guns had ultimately blinded them to the tactical potential of the dark. They failed to adapt to the specialized asymmetry of the British patrols, choosing instead to hunker down in their dugouts and pray that their tripwires held. It was a fatal failure of imagination that cost them the psychological high ground in northern France. The British had not just taken the night, they had weaponized the very concept of silence, turning the German army's own defensive architecture into a sprawling, claustrophobic trap. The elite, boastful hunters of the Third Reich had been systematically reduced to shivering, exhausted prey, proving that even the most lethal marksman is entirely useless if he is too terrified to close his eyes. The legacy of these silent trench raids remains a chilling testament to the devastating power of psychological warfare. The British didn't need to destroy every German bunker in Normandy. They only needed to convince the men inside them that the darkness was full of ghosts. They began the summer believing their sniper hides were impenetrable fortresses of the Reich. They ended it staring into the shadows, paralyzed by the dread of a suppressed whisper and a blackened blade. For the Axis soldier, it wasn't just the guns, planes, or tanks that were terrifying. It was the Allied ingenuity they could never predict.